when you're fooling with a nut like this, that's a pervert, you can expect most anything. Or they use instruments, a rack and so forth for their sex acts.
Good evening. Profile, a Houston tragedy, is only a title, for what you are about to see defies any brief verbal description. It is a look at what regrettably may become the most sordid story in the annals of American crime. Perhaps as many as 30 teenage boys brutally tortured, murdered, and buried in and around the Houston area. I'm David Glott. For the next 30 minutes, we will try to examine this bizarre chain of events that came to light on Wednesday. At that time, developments were already beginning to piece together, and law enforcement officials were beginning to feel pangs of horror. Their worst fears would be realized. Eyewitness News correspondent Larry Connors has covered the story since that first night.
David, this entire story of sadistic homosexual slayings would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. It's that hard to believe. So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. But it's not fiction. It's very real. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century. An innocent-looking Pasadena home, but some of the people who went in were carried out in plastic bags. They had been murdered. Death in most cases came after the victims had been subjected to various sex acts and torture. The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens who allegedly had been lured into a death trap by this young man, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. It was Henley who unveiled this secret of mass killings and led police to the graves of the dead. Henley called the police to the home of Dean Corll. He said he killed that Pasadena resident. Henley said the 34-year-old Corll had talked about killing several young men and burying them in this boat storage in South Houston. Henley said he and two other young people were intended victims Wednesday morning. At that time, they had passed out at Corll's house after an all-night party.
I woke up and he was clamping handcuffs on me. I was laying on my stomach. The other two were on their stomach and they were handcuffed and their feet were tied. I can't remember whether he tied my feet afterwards or they were tied when I woke up. I'd torture him if he'd let me go.
Was he gonna, would he want you to kill them then?
To begin with, he wanted to kill me. He was mad because I brought the chick over there. The chick wanted to run away from home and I was gonna travel with Dean. I thought it was safe. I didn't know no better.
Henley said Corll did turn him loose, and then he described what happened next to the others, another young man and a teenage girl.
He let me up and took them into a bedroom and strapped them to the board. Strapped Tim on his stomach, spread eagle on the board, and strapped Rhonda beside the board beside Tim on her back. First he wanted Tim to take Rhonda, but Tim couldn't or he wouldn't or something. And so he wanted me to take her, and he was going to mess with Tim.
Henley said at one point, Corll put down his gun. He picked it up, ordered Corll to release the other victims, but he refused. And Henley says he shot Corll repeatedly. Henley's initial story makes it sound as if he were in effect a hero. But police suspicions were confirmed the next day. Henley said he had been involved in the murder and burial of some victims found in the dirt floor of this storage shed. For most of Wednesday night, lawmen continued to unearth bodies. All supposedly young boys, early to mid-teens, all had their hands tied, the bodies wrapped in plastic. Lime had been poured over the victims to help decompose the bodies. It did a more than adequate job. Bits and pieces of skeletons were removed time and time again. In some cases, flesh clung to bones like jelly. The stench inside that shed was almost overpowering. Those with weak stomachs stayed out. Just before closing down the digging operations for that night, a lieutenant in the Houston Homicide Division talked about the victims and he talked about the killers.
How would you classify this series of crimes?
Just like I said a while ago, a hell of a sadistic type of a clown that'd pull something like this.
And you think most of these victims are young boys?
I'm pretty reasonably sure they are. The reports that we have, missing persons, are all a bunch of kids, 13, 14, 15 years old.
The death site and the grave site itself appears tragic enough, but do you think many of them went under any torture?
Well, when you're fooling with a nut like this, that's a pervert, you can expect mostly anything. Or they use instruments and a rack and so forth for their sex acts.
So the digging operation ceased for that night. Now the public knew 8 bodies had been found in this shed, but this was just beginning, and that became evident the following day. Thursday, lawmen returned to the grave site. Shovels again dug into the soil in the 12 by 30 shed. The death count started rising. There was another body, and still another, and another. When the digging was finally completed in this shed, 17 bodies had been recovered. According to the owners of the boat storage, Dean Corll had always been prompt in paying his rent on this boat stall, which he had for nearly 3 years. Recently, he had been politely asking the owners if they didn't have another stall for rent. He said his was getting too crowded. 17 bodies, shocking, terrifying, and yet there were still more to be found. The trail of graves stretched into the piney woods of East Texas near Sam Rayburn Lake, not too far from Lufkin. Henley told lawmen that he helped Corll bury more victims in this area. At this time, 18-year-old David Brooks of Houston was also in custody as a suspect. Henley pointed to one spot and said, "There are 2 bodies here, but only one was uncovered." So Henley said, "That means there are 2 at the other site." After killing a rattlesnake, lawmen and newsmen moved cautiously through the heavy brush to the next location. Again, the shovels dug in, and Henley decided to start talking again also.
Now, these just some boys that he picked up, or I helped him get, rather. And he raped them, ended up killing them, brought them down here and buried them.
What part did you play in that?
And I helped him pick them.
What part did you play in any of the killing, or did you?
No comment.
Wayne, this has been going on for some time, hasn't it?
A year ago last winter.
That's when you got into it.
Yes.
Now, you know, or you think you know, that maybe he was involved in this more than a year ago, right?
I know.
In what way do you know?
And I was told
By him?
by him, by David Brooks.
Now, David Brooks is another person who has been named. Now, what role did he play in all of this?
Same as mine.
The digging at the second spot produced only one more body before lawmen decided to call a halt for the night. They were to return the next morning, and they would uncover 2 more victims. That meant one Henley didn't know about. In other words, how many others could have been killed before Henley or Brooks became a part of all of this? It was possible, Henley said, that Corll had other young men working for him in the past, using them to procure boys for his sexual fantasies, using them to pimp for him, and then later killing them just as he started to murder Henley. There could be dozens of other bodies, and the only man who could possibly tell the entire grisly story was Dean Corll, and he was dead. Yesterday, the trail of graves took lawmen and newsmen to the southeast of Houston. Henley and Brooks said there were more bodies buried along the Gulf of Mexico. By now, the scene was becoming all too familiar. Shovels digging into dirt and yielding bodies. Heavy equipment was called in to assist in the recovery operations. Since there were few landmarks along the beach, Henley was having some trouble recalling the graves, but his directions did uncover more human remains. The white of lime mixed with the red of blood, bones, bits of flesh, again the undescribable smell of a decayed human body. The operations moved down the beach. At one point it stopped beside this camper. A Beaumont family out to spend a quiet day along the Gulf learned that they were within 10 feet of another victim. As the digging started and revealed the remains of still another body, the family packed up their camper. Yes, they had heard about the mass killings, but to learn that they were at the same spot where a teenage boy had been buried under 2 feet of sand. The Beaumont couple and their son headed for home. Before Henley and Brooks were returned to jail, Henley wanted to talk to reporters. He had told me earlier that the stories he read in the newspapers contained lies. Henley said he wanted to clear up and correct things, like his full name, and what happened to that girl at Corll's house Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, and a couple of other things most important to him.
And when that boy turned himself in, I had not yet made a statement. I didn't make a statement till after he made his. So I didn't implicate him. He hung himself. And that's all I want to say. I never said there were 30 people. I said 24. The name's Junior, not Elmer Wayne Henley. Well, get your pictures.
Elmer Wayne Henley, Jr., a young man who says now that he can sleep and live since this nightmare is out in the open. David.